My mother was a true partner to my father in the very early days of the business. She was really right there on the firing line with my dad, and she would convince him to calm down, relax, let's try this and see if it'll work. And she was really a great source of balance in our family.
She was sort of the velvet glove that covered the strong, firm hand of J.W. Marriott, and not only covered it and made it softer, but often controlled it. Well, my mother married my father when she was 19 years old. She just graduated with honors from the University of Utah. You know, they started out, this new A&W restaurant only had one item on the menu, and that was nickel root beer. So they started talking to their customers, and what do you want? And they found out Mexican food was pretty hot thing at that time. She went over to the Mexican embassy and talked to the chef over there, and he gave her his secret recipe for hot tamales and chili.
She cooked all the Mexican food in her apartment and brought it to the Hot Shop restaurant because there was no kitchen in the root beer stand.
Her cookbook had absolutely fallen apart. And so I took it, and Debbie went through it with me to help pick out the very favorite things. And I put together this book of her best recipes, and I made enough of them that all of the daughters-in-law and the granddaughters, as they get married, I have one for each of them.
I think my earliest memory was at the farm. I always remember her. She had on a red flannel shirt and blue jeans, and I had never seen my grandmother that way. She used to always wear dresses, and I thought, my grandmother's very down to earth.
My grandmother and I used to spend a lot of time together in New Hampshire, and we played a lot of cards. And she was the one who taught me how to shuffle cards. And we played a lot of gin. And then, you know, we had trips to the farm, which she took a lot of the grandchildren on, but my sister Sandy and I used to spend hours shelling walnuts for the brownies. My favorite recipe that she had was her raspberry jam.
Raspberry jam in the summer, just how Grandma did it. And chili sauce, that was another one. The lasagna. In fact, I have original recipe in her hand with sauce dripping all over them. My grandmother and I both love chocolate. Love chocolate.
She knew I loved spaghetti and meat sauce. And so when I'd go over there, she would have a huge bowl of spaghetti with her own private recipe of meat sauce, which was my favorite dish in all the world.
Well, she was an incredibly intelligent woman, and someone who was also very compassionate. She was always supportive of me when I was growing up, and I wasn't always the easiest child to handle for my parents. But she, I think, understood the saying that goes, "Good boys make boring adults," and she always stood by my side and supported me, and was always a great example of compassion and really believing in people.
Dick and I were married as juniors between our spring and winter quarters in college at the University of Utah. So we had 3 summers that we lived with Dick's parents. And I think there was a great respect for each other. And that came, though, not right off the bat, that came through working together and being together and having occasions to spend time together. And I think that's the bottom line, is to spend time together where you're not judging somebody, but just being a part of their lives.
She graduated from college at age 19, majored in a language, which most women didn't do back then, helped start a business, and then she did a great thing when she had kids. She stayed home and raised the kids. Then she got back into the business and helped my grandfather.
When people were around my grandmother, they really wanted to be their best self because that was the way she always presented herself.
My mother-in-law was the needlepoint queen, and this is the original crest that she came up with. The motto in Latin is, "Be what you seem to be." She was very proud of it. She had it in her library, and we have it in our library today.
A lot of my memories were from the farm, and I would see my grandmother spend a lot of time in the house and taking care of my grandfather. It was clear that she always supported him and often was in the background, but at the end of the day, she was the only one that could really handle him.
As I grew older, I started realizing all of her different accomplishments. At the time, I remember going to her and saying, how am I supposed to live up to your legacy? And she did say, you know, just do what you're doing right now. Look after your family, continue to be involved in your community, and it'll all work out. I think my grandma would be fascinated by the political situation this year. She loved politics, and I remember as a kid and growing up in Washington, D.C., she loved to follow what was going on, and I think this year has been super exciting and interesting, and I think she would probably be loving it, and she would have an opinion, and it'd be exciting to hear about.
Well, my mom and dad were very active politically. She kept up her interest in politics throughout her life, but she was always very active, very supportive.
Didn't she have a perfect track record of predicting every president too? I just remember hearing that, and as a kid we would go over and be like, who's the next president going to be?
My mother was very interested in politics. She kind of grew up in a political atmosphere after she was married because my grandmother married Senator Reed Smoot, who was a senior senator from Utah. And he was in office when my mother was living in Washington, and of course, living in Washington, you're surrounded by politics. She became very active in the Republican Party. She was a D.C. committee woman for Washington, and she was the treasurer for 2 Republican national conventions. She really got to know the leadership in Washington, and they admired her greatly. She was one of the very first trustees of the Kennedy Center, and when the Kennedy Center was built and opened, my mom and dad raised the money to build and establish the Eisenhower Theater.
Oh, when I think of Grandma, and if I had to think of a few words to describe her, she was deeply caring.
She was intelligent, confident, kind, and never looked for the spotlight, but got a lot accomplished in her life.
Well, my mother was a quiet contributor.
She was extremely loyal.
She was take charge. She
just was a doer, a quiet doer.
She was a very private person who was very devoted to her husband and her sons.
And she was proud of both of her boys. She was very happy to be a part of their lives, and yet she was happy to see them excel.
If my mother were still alive, she would be shocked at the size of the company and how successful the 2 companies are. Really, now we are 2 companies, Marriott International and Host Hotels and Resorts. But Marriott International now has over 3,000 hotels. It's extremely successful, one of the most admired companies in the country. And Host Hotels and Resorts is the largest hotel real estate investment trust in the world, as far as we know, and it's also extremely successful. So she would be thrilled to see what she and my dad started out so many years ago is now so successful.